They called them the Night Witches, a name whispered in terror by German soldiers during the darkest nights of World War II. To them, these weren't ordinary pilots, they were phantoms, witches of the wind, riding invisible brooms through the midnight sky. When the moon was hidden and silence ruled the front lines, a faint rustle would break the air, a soft, eerie hum like the whisper of wings. Moments later, bombs would fall, explosions would rip through camps and supply lines, and before anyone could see who had done it, the sky would be empty once again. Those haunting figures were not ghosts, they were real. Young Soviet women, barely out of their teens, flying fragile wooden planes through enemy fire, armed with nothing but courage, precision, and sheer willpower. It all began in 1941. Operation Barbarossa, Germany's massive invasion of the Soviet Union, had shattered the Eastern Front. Entire cities were burning, soldiers retreating, and hope seemed to fade with each passing day. But among the ruins of that chaos, one woman refused to surrender, Marina Raskova. Known as the Soviet Amelia Earhart, Raskova was already a legendary aviator, a record breaker who had once flown across the Soviet Union in freezing storms. Now, she had a new mission: to form an entirely female air regiment for combat. Her idea shocked military officials. Women in combat? Flying bombers? It sounded absurd. The generals laughed. The bureaucrats rolled their eyes. But Raskova wouldn't take no for an answer. She went straight to Stalin himself. And somehow, he said yes. Within months, recruitment began. Hundreds of women from across the Soviet Union volunteered. Students, nurses, teachers, farm girls, each willing to trade their comfort for combat, their safety for the sky. They came with no guarantees, only one shared dream: to defend their homeland. In October 1941, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was officially formed, the first all-female combat aviation unit in history. Their training was brutal. They were issued oversized men's uniforms, boots far too big, and aircraft so outdated that even male pilots refused to fly them. Their plane, the Polikarpov Po-2, was made of wood and canvas. It had no radio, no armor, and no advanced instruments, just a flimsy frame, two bombs, and an open cockpit that froze them to the bone. But what seemed like a weakness became their greatest weapon. The Po-2 could glide silently through the night. Its small size made it almost invisible to radar, and when they cut the engine and descended in the dark, all that could be heard was a soft, ghostly whoosh, like a broom sweeping through the air. That sound struck fear deep into German hearts. They began to call them die Nachthexen, the Night Witches. To the Germans, the name was born of superstition. To the women, it became a badge of honor. Night after night, they took off from rough dirt runways. Winter of 1942. The Eastern Front was a frozen graveyard. The land lay buried under snow, the skies heavy with smoke, and every night the darkness swallowed sound and hope alike. From far off, faint engines hummed, tiny, fragile planes cutting through the cold. The Night Witches were on the move again. By now their legend had begun to spread. German sentries whispered about them over campfires. Officers issued orders with trembling hands. Do not look up when you hear them, run. But the women in those wooden planes felt none of that power, only exhaustion and hunger. Their faces wine-burned, their fingers numb on the controls. They were fighting not just an enemy, but the very elements of nature. Their base was nothing more than a stretch of frozen earth. No lights, no shelter, just wind. They slept in barns beside their aircraft, fixing bullet holes with scraps of fabric, warming their hands on engine heat before another mission. Each sortie began the same way: a whisper from the commander, a map spread on the ground, and a moment of silence before takeoff. Then, the cough of an old Po-2 engine, the smell of oil and smoke, and the slow lift into a sky that promised nothing but danger. Their targets were supply depots, ammunition trains, and encampments. They flew low, so low they could see faces on the ground. Tracer fire followed them like red snakes through the night. One pilot described it later. It felt like flying through a rainstorm of fire. You didn't breathe. You just became part of the plane. Often, they returned with holes in their wings, sometimes bleeding, sometimes crying, but always returning. They learned to drop their bombs in silence, cut the engine at the edge of the target, glide, release, disappear. The Germans grew paranoid. They started calling in night patrols, radar units, even flak towers. Nothing worked. The Po-2 was too small, too slow, too quiet. One general once said in anger, "We can shoot down a falcon, but not these damn bats." As their success grew, so did their losses. The Night Witches flew without radar, without navigation lights, and often without weapons for self-defense. When a plane was hit, it went down in flames, and the sky lit up like a funeral pyre. Still, they never stopped. In one mission near Kursk, a young pilot named Irina Sabrova Took off 10 times in a single night, 10 times under enemy fire. When she landed after the last run, the ground crew counted over 40 holes in her plane. She just smiled and said, "It still flies." Their determination was a weapon more deadly than any bomb. They flew so often that some became disoriented, forgetting which direction was home. Sometimes the wind carried them too far, and they'd land in enemy fields, captured if lucky, vanished if not. But for every loss, two new volunteers stepped forward. It was not duty alone. It was defiance. Their commander, Yevgeny Bershinskaya. The winter of 1943 brought a silence to the front. Not peace, just the pause between storms. Snow covered the ruined cities like a shroud, and beneath it, the scars of war slept restlessly. But in that cold, moonless quiet, something else stirred, the faint hum of vengeance. The night witches were taking off again. Their targets had moved farther west now, deep behind enemy lines. Each mission meant flying longer, higher, and often not coming back. Yet still, they flew, because they knew that every crate of ammunition destroyed, every German convoy delayed, bought one more day for those fighting on the ground. The women had become experts of the unseen. They learned to read the wind like scripture, to navigate by stars and intuition. They marked villages not by names, but by the glow of fires below. Their aircraft, the Polikarpov Po-2, was never meant for war. It was a training plane, made of wood and canvas. The engine rattled like a heartbeat under strain, and every bullet that hit it sounded like rain on paper. But perhaps that's what made them unstoppable. They were underestimated, invisible, unpredictable. One German officer wrote in his diary, "We cannot fight what we cannot see. They come with the night, and they leave with the wind." Each flight began the same way, an embrace, a breath, a silent prayer. Sometimes they would trace a finger along the edge of the cockpit, as if saying goodbye to a friend. Then, the takeoff, wheels scraping against frozen ground, the engine gasping, the earth falling away beneath them. Up there, they were free. Free from rank, from rules, from fear, until the flak guns began. Explosions painted the sky in white and orange. The night became a dance of survival. Cut the engine, glide, drop the bombs, disappear. That was their rhythm, a heartbeat of war in the silence of night. But sometimes, the silence lasted too long. Sometimes, one of the planes didn't return. Back at the airfield, the women would wait, eyes fixed on the horizon, listening for that faint hum, the sound of life. Minutes turned to hours, hours to dawn. And when the first light touched the snow, they knew, if she hadn't come back by then, she never would. They buried their fallen with scraps of fabric for flags. No flowers, no music, just a promise whispered in the cold air. "We'll finish your flight." By the spring of 1944, they had flown over 20,000 sorties. Their names began appearing in Soviet dispatches, and even Western reporters wrote about the witches of the night sky. But fame meant nothing to them. They had no medals, no luxuries, no rest, only missions. What kept them going? Perhaps it was vengeance, perhaps duty, or maybe it was each other. Because in the frozen dark, when the world below burned and the stars looked like ghosts, they had only one another. One navigator once wrote in her journal, "When I heard her voice in my headset, I wasn't afraid anymore. Her calm meant I wasn't alone." By midsummer of 1943, the Eastern Front had become a furnace. The Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history, was turning the land into a graveyard of metal and fire. The sky was never quiet anymore. Day and night, the roar of engines shook the earth. But above it all, there was a sound the Germans learned to fear the most, the whisper of wooden wings. The night witches were called to fly again, not for harassment runs this time, but for something far more dangerous. The Red Army needed them to cripple supply routes, cut off reinforcements, and fly through the densest anti-air fire ever seen. It was a mission most pilots wouldn't dare to accept, but these women didn't hesitate. They loaded their bombs by hand, checked their maps under lantern light, and in the stillness before takeoff, they looked at one another, not with fear, but with quiet understanding. They knew that some wouldn't return. The first wave took off just after midnight. Engines sputtered in protest, fighting against the humid summer air. As the planes climbed, the horizon glowed red, not from the sunrise, but from burning cities below. Each pilot flew barely 50 feet above the ground, weaving through clouds of smoke, navigating only by instinct and moonlight. Tracer rounds sliced the darkness like lightning. One wrong move, and the sky became a death trap. Yet somehow, they pressed forward, dropping bombs in perfect formation, vanishing into the night before the enemy could react. Witnesses on the ground said it looked unreal. Tiny sparks in the sky, like fireflies drifting through hell. Hours later, as they returned to base, one of the planes didn't come back. Then another, and another. Silence. The airfield waited in darkness. Every head turned toward the horizon, hoping to see that familiar silhouette, but only smoke rolled in from the distance. At dawn, the survivors counted the losses. 3 planes down, 6 women gone, their names carved into the wooden tail of a Potu, a promise that they'd never be forgotten. That night, the squadron commander gathered everyone together. No orders, no speeches, just one question. Do we stop? No one spoke. Then one of the youngest pilots, barely 19, stepped forward and said quietly, "If we stop now, their deaths mean nothing." That was all it took. By the next evening, they were back in the air. Courage, it seemed, was contagious. The following missions were even more dangerous. German patrols had learned their tactics. Searchlights swept the sky. Batteries waited with loaded guns. To survive, the night witches changed their rhythm. They flew lower, faster, sometimes cutting the engine midair to glide silently past enemy lines. The moment they dropped their bombs, they would restart the engine, a sound like thunder breaking through a heartbeat of silence. That sound became legend. To the Germans, it meant death was already above them. To the Soviets, it meant hope still flew. Winter returned, harsh and unrelenting. The year was 1944, and the German retreat had begun. But for the night witches, the war was far from over. They were sent farther west, into colder, darker skies, where even the moon refused to follow. The missions now were longer, the risks greater, and the silence heavier. Each flight carried not just bombs, but the weight of every loss they had endured. Each takeoff felt like a conversation with fate. They had flown more than 23,000 sorties by now. Their planes, patched together with canvas and hope, still cut through the wind like whispers of vengeance. And every time they rose into the air, they carried with them the memory of those who never came back. In January, during one of the coldest nights of the year, a blizzard swept through the steppe. Visibility dropped to nothing. Radio contact was lost. 3 planes disappeared from radar. For hours, command tried to reach them. Nothing. At dawn, search teams went out. They found wreckage scattered across the frozen fields. A shattered wing, a torn uniform, and a logbook half buried in the snow. Inside it, the last entry read only 5 words. Engines failed. Still going forward. No one spoke. No one could. Those 5 words became a mantra whispered through every Soviet camp that winter. It wasn't just courage anymore. It was defiance against the impossible. By spring, their legend had spread across the front lines. Even German prisoners spoke of them with a kind of awe. They said the witches could fly without light, without sound, appearing from nowhere, and disappearing into the dark. One captured German officer confessed, "When we heard their engines cut, we stopped breathing, because we knew the silence meant death." It was fear, yes, but also respect. The women of the 588th didn't just fight a war. They changed what war could mean. They proved that bravery had no gender, that endurance had no face. And as the Red Army advanced toward Berlin, they followed, bomb after bomb, night after night, until the stars themselves seemed to burn out. When victory was finally declared in May 1945, the night witches returned to their airfield one last time. The planes were torn and tired. So were they? There were no grand parades waiting, no cameras, no crowds, just silence. The same silence that had carried them through the war. They stood together in the dawn light, watching the smoke clear across the horizon. And then, one by one, they walked away, leaving behind only footprints in the dust and stories that would outlive them all. Years later, the same airfield was abandoned. Grass grew over the runways. Hangars crumbled to rust. But sometimes, on quiet nights, locals say they hear something above the trees. A faint engine hum, a soft whistle of wind, and the distant echo of laughter carried by the cold. They say it's just the wind. But those who know, those who remember, say it's the night